It all started with a missing man, a young woman in a red dress, and a surveillance tape that raised more questions than it answered. Emily Parker believed she was making a hard choice to help her family, but without knowing it, she stepped into a battle that had been quietly raging for decades. Behind a single night's events lay old money, long-held grudges, and dangerous secrets some people would do anything to keep buried. Emily wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time. She was the last loose end, and the clock was already ticking. But before we begin, write in the comments where you're from. I'm curious to see how far these stories can travel. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new captivating tales. Let's begin. Some stories, folks think, begin at the moment something breaks, a scream, a gunshot, a door slamming too hard. But those are just echoes. Ripples from a stone that was already thrown. The truth? It begins in silence. In the quiet moments no one ever bothers to notice. This story, Emily Parker's story, begins not with violence, but with hope. A fragile, flickering kind of hope. Emily wasn't the kind of girl who drew trouble. She wasn't loud. Wasn't reckless. She wore old sweaters and kept her hair in a bun, smiled with that soft kind of sadness that made you feel like you'd known her all your life. She lived in a little walk-up apartment in Cleveland, tucked between forgotten factories and gray skies. Shared the place with her mama, Judith, once a nurse, now too tired to get out of bed, too proud to ask for help. Judith was sick. The kind of sick with long Latin names and longer bills. The doctors said she needed surgery. The hospital said she needed cash. And cash, well, that was one thing Emily didn't have. She sold her laptop. Pawned her mother's jewelry. Worked 2 jobs, and then some. Still came up short. $1,000 short. And in this country, short means no treatment. No surgery. No second chances. That was the moment Rachel Morgan walked back into her life. Rachel had been a high school friend once. Beautiful, dangerous, and always 10 steps ahead of the rest of the world. These days, she wore silk scarves, drove a Lexus, and smelled like expensive secrets. She didn't offer comfort. She offered a way out. Aurora Connections, she said, tapping a glossy business card. Discreet. Safe. Classy. One night, M. That's all. You'll never have to do it again. Emily stared at the card like it might bite her. Selling her time, her company, herself. It clashed with every piece of pride her mama had ever stitched into her soul. But when you watch someone you love fade breath by breath, morals become a luxury you can't afford. So she said yes. That's how Emily Parker found herself riding in a black town car, snow tapping at the windows, red velvet dress clinging to her like borrowed confidence. The Sherwood Tower in downtown Chicago rose above her like a castle made of secrets. The man waiting for her inside was not what she expected. He was young, 35, maybe. Sharp suit. Kind eyes. The kind of man who'd seen sorrow, and somehow stayed warm anyway. I'm not here to use you, he said gently. I just didn't know how else to meet you. Emily blinked. You arranged this? He nodded. I heard your story. I wanted to help. You reminded me of someone I lost. They danced. They drank wine. They talked about books and jazz and things that didn't belong at a charity gala filled with investors and politicians. He introduced her as a writer from Ohio. It wasn't true. But it felt true. And somewhere between dessert and goodbye, Emily forgot she was working. Forgot the price tag on her evening. Forgot what she'd come there to do. Ethan drove her back himself. Gave her a soft smile and a folded envelope of cash. I want to see you again, he said. But next time, not like this. That night, for the first time in months, Emily felt hope. And that hope lasted exactly 3 days. On the third morning, the Cleveland Dispatch ran a story. Prominent Chicago entrepreneur missing after charity gala. Ethan Walker. Last seen with a woman in a red dress. Detectives came knocking before the coffee was even cold. 2 men in winter coats. Stone-faced. Eyes tired. They asked Emily questions. Where did Ethan go after the event? Had he said anything strange? Mentioned anyone watching him? Emily told them the truth. Every word of it. But sometimes, the truth doesn't matter. Because they found something. Surveillance footage. A grainy black and white image from a side entrance. There was Emily. Red dress. Alone. Talking to a man whose face was lost in the shadows. Next frame. Emily running. The one after that. Nothing. No Ethan. No man. Just shadows. The media pounced. Escort. Red dress. Missing millionaire. Didn't matter that Emily had told the truth. The story they wanted was easier to sell. A desperate girl. A rich man. A scandal. Emily fit the picture far too well. Rachel vanished. Aurora Connections stopped answering the phone. The money Ethan had given Emily. Frozen. Account flagged for investigation. And just like that, Emily went from hopeful to hunted. But sometimes, when everything breaks, that's when help finds you. His name was Sam Holloway. An old-school detective. Wore suspenders. Drove a Buick. Still used a flip phone. He didn't trust computers. He trusted instincts. And he saw something no one else did. It was in the footage. One frame. A reflection in a window behind Emily. A man's wrist. A watch. Not Ethan's. Not hers. Someone else. Sam pulled tapes from every nearby building. Cross-checked license plates. Ran facial recognition. And finally, he found a name. Thomas Greer. A disgraced ex-cop. Suspended for evidence tampering. Vanished 2 days before Ethan did. That's when the story changed. Emily wasn't the last person to see Ethan Walker. She wasn't alone in that alley. And the man she spoke to? He'd disappeared, too. Now there were 2 missing men. One kind. One corrupt. And only one woman left standing in the middle. But Emily couldn't remember any of it. Nothing after the moment Ethan kissed her hand goodbye. Nothing except a scarf in her purse. Torn. Frozen. Stained with blood. And in the corner, stitched in fading thread. 2 letters. E.W. There's a kind of silence that doesn't come from peace or rest, it comes from not knowing what you've forgotten, and being afraid to remember. That's where Emily Parker lived now. Not behind bars. Not under arrest. But in a kind of fog that made every memory feel like it belonged to someone else. She sat on the edge of her bed each morning with the quilt tangled at her feet, sunlight leaking through the blinds like a secret trying to escape. Her mother, Judith, still asked gentle questions about breakfast or sleep, or whether Emily would come sit for just a moment in the living room. But Emily couldn't speak about that night, not with the pieces still scattered across her mind like broken glass. She didn't remember leaving the gala. She didn't remember the alley. She didn't remember the man in the shadows. All she had was that scarf. Torn. Frozen. And stained with Ethan's blood. Detective Sam Holloway had seen this kind of thing before, not just in war zones or crime scenes, but in people's eyes after the truth breaks them. He knew trauma could fracture the brain the way earthquakes fracture pavement, leaving gaps where the world used to be whole. So he didn't press. He didn't accuse. He just sat across from her in a quiet room with tile floors and a smell like old bleach and older memories, sliding photographs across the table like a man offering ghosts. "This is the man we believe you saw in that alley," he said, voice low and steady, the kind that didn't demand trust, it earned it one sentence at a time. "His name is Thomas Greer. Used to wear a badge. Suspended in 2009. After that, he disappeared into shadows most folks never come back from." Emily stared at the photo like it might come alive and confess something. His face looked tired, weathered, like it had seen too much and felt none of it. But behind those eyes was a coldness she couldn't describe, a kind of hollow place where morality had once lived and been quietly evicted. "I don't know him," she whispered, but even she wasn't sure if that was true or just something she needed to believe. Sam leaned forward, not threatening, just closer, like proximity might somehow bridge the gap in her memory. "Maybe not," he said. "But he knew you. He waited outside the hotel. Followed you into the alley. And then you were gone." Emily clenched the edge of the table until her knuckles turned pale, her breath shallow, her pulse loud enough to drown the world around her. Then Sam said something that made the air leave the room. "I don't think you ran from him," he said softly. "I think you were chasing him." The surveillance footage told a story no one wanted to believe. There she was, frozen mid-step, one hand raised, not in fear, but like she was calling out or reaching for something. Greer stood opposite her, his face only half visible, but his posture clear, defensive, tense, alert. And then, just before the frame went dark, her hand reached into his coat. "Look at your hand," Sam said quietly. "What were you reaching for, Emily?" But Emily didn't answer, not because she was hiding anything, but because her mind simply wouldn't give her the answer. She remembered the taste of chocolate truffle and red wine. She remembered the music echoing through the marble ballroom. She remembered Ethan's fingers brushing hers, trembling slightly, like he was already afraid he'd lose her. Everything after that was ash. No footsteps. No voices. Just a scarf in her purse and a headache behind her eyes that throbbed like a question begging to be asked. That night, Sam Holloway sat alone in his precinct office, the blinds half closed, the hum of overhead lights matching the rhythm of his thoughts. He didn't trust coincidences. Didn't believe in neat endings. And there was one part of this story that still didn't sit right. Ethan Walker wasn't just a charming man with a kind smile and a checkbook full of good intentions. He came from money, old money, the kind with dirt under its nails and blood in its closet. His father had once been a consultant for an oil company, the kind of man who whispered into the ears of politicians and kings. Until one day, he blew the whistle. Turned on the people who made him rich. And then died in a house fire. The official report said accidental. But everyone else called it a warning. Ethan had tried to leave all that behind. Started fresh. Clean foundation. Philanthropy. Hope. But the past has long arms. And one of them was named Rachel Morgan. Sam followed the money first. He always did. And what he found made his stomach turn. Rachel Morgan, the friend who'd handed Emily the business card and the velvet dress, wasn't just a recruiter. She wasn't just working for Aurora Connections. She had once dated Ethan Walker. Briefly. Secretly. Before he knew who she really worked for. Sam found it buried in her financials. A single line, consulting revenue. Paid monthly. From a holding firm in Belize. On paper, it looked clean. But no one pays 5 figures a month to a woman like Rachel for nothing but introductions. And one of the directors behind that holding firm? Thomas Greer. The man from the alley. The man with the watch. The man who was supposed to be retired, disgraced, forgotten. That's when Sam knew. This wasn't just about Ethan. This was about legacy. About secrets. About leverage. Greer hadn't gone underground to hide. He'd gone underground to work. The next morning, Sam found Rachel in Toledo. Working under a fake name. pouring drinks at a downtown lounge. Pretending she'd never met anyone named Emily Parker. It took 2 hours, a warrant, and every ounce of patience Sam had left to get her into an interrogation room. She looked shaken. Not from guilt. But from fear. "I was trying to help," she said, hands trembling hard enough to make the cuffs clink against the table. Ethan wasn't supposed to disappear. He just wanted to talk to Greer. Make him stop. Stop what? Sam asked, voice low, steady, and deadly calm. Rachel leaned in, voice barely above a whisper, like the walls themselves might be listening. Greer was blackmailing him. Said he had evidence on his father's death. But it wasn't about the truth. It was about control. Then she paused. And what she said next rewrote the whole damn story. Emily didn't know any of this. She was just the bait. Greer knew Ethan wouldn't come unless it was personal. He used her to make him show up. Sam drove home that night in silence, the highway stretching like a question he didn't want to answer. Now the picture was clearer. Ethan had fallen for Emily. And someone had used that love to make him disappear. But one question still burned like a match pressed to the skin. If Greer took Ethan, why leave Emily alive? Loose ends don't get spared. Unless. They're not loose ends. They're leverage. When Sam got back to the station, the lab results on the bloody scarf had finally come in. The blood? Confirmed. Ethan Walker's. But the real surprise wasn't in the stain. It was in the corner. A partial fingerprint. One clear enough to match. Not Greer's. Not Emily's. It belonged to a woman. No criminal record. No priors. Nothing remarkable. Just a name. Lillian Cross. And when Sam pulled her file, he almost dropped it. Because she wasn't just a nobody. She had once worked as a secretary for Jonathan Walker. Ethan's father. And her maiden name? Greer. Thomas Greer's sister. Some stories are puzzles. Some are traps. And some are spiderwebs. And Sam Holloway had just found the spider. But the question was no longer what happened to Ethan Walker. The question was, why was Emily still alive to tell the tale? There's a moment, just before a storm begins, when the air goes quiet in that strange, heavy way that makes you hold your breath. That's what it felt like for Detective Sam Holloway as he stared at the name printed on the report. Lillian Cross. Once known as Lillian Greer. Sister of a disgraced cop. Secretary to a dead oil tycoon. And now, tied to a scarf soaked in the blood of a man who never came home. Sam didn't believe in coincidence, not when it came wrapped in red thread and whispered lies. He believed in patterns, in connections, in the way the past doesn't stay buried unless someone is actively shoveling dirt. So he pulled every file he could find, court transcripts, company memos, old newspaper clippings so faded the words felt like secrets scratched into stone. And slowly, a story began to form. Lillian had worked for Jonathan Walker for almost 12 years, managing appointments, filing reports, and answering phones that never stopped ringing with the voices of very dangerous men. On the night of the fire that killed Jonathan, she was logged as the last person to leave the house. But something about the timing didn't make sense. She had clocked out before the alarm system recorded the front door closing. And then, like clockwork, she vanished. Changed her name. Moved states. Reappeared 10 years later working for nonprofits funded by Ethan Walker. Not directly. Not obviously. But through layers, shell companies, anonymous donors, funding committees that never met in person. She'd embedded herself into Ethan's new life like a splinter hidden beneath the skin, small, unnoticed, and potentially deadly if left unchecked. Sam knew he couldn't go back to Emily without something solid. Her mind was still fractured, memories locked behind doors she didn't know existed. But now he had a key. He had a name. So the next morning, he knocked on Emily's door with coffee in one hand and a folder in the other, knowing full well that what he was about to show her could change everything. She looked tired, paler than usual, eyes rimmed with the kind of quiet that comes from nights spent staring at the ceiling, trying to remember what you're trying to forget. He laid the folder on the kitchen table like a priest placing scripture. "This is Lillian Cross," he said, his voice gentle but unflinching. "She used to go by Greer. She was your date's father's secretary. She was there the night the fire started. And I think she was in that alley with you." Emily's hands trembled as she reached for the photograph. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies. Just enough to make the paper flutter against her skin like it was alive. And then. A breath. Sharp. Sudden. Like her lungs remembered something before her mind did. "I've seen her," she whispered. "Not in the papers. Not here. There." She tapped the photo. "In the alley. She's the one who whispered to me. Memory doesn't always return like a wave. Sometimes it comes back like a needle, sharp, small, and piercing in ways you didn't expect." Emily remembered leather gloves. Cold fingers against her cheek. A scent, jasmine and smoke. And a voice, soft but terrifying. "He belongs to us now." Those 5 words were all she heard before her world turned black. She told Sam everything. Every flicker of recollection. Every jagged image. Every feeling that felt more real than reason allowed. And when she finished, Sam didn't say a word. He just nodded slowly, the way a man nods at a grave he's visited too many times. "That scarf didn't end up in your purse by accident," he said after a long silence. "They wanted you to find it. They wanted to make sure you didn't forget. Even if you couldn't remember." Emily leaned back in her chair like the truth itself had weight. "What does she want from me?" she asked, barely audible. Sam took out a letter, old, creased, hand-addressed, no return address. It had arrived at the precinct that morning. He slid it across the table. "Maybe Ethan can answer that." Emily unfolded the letter with hands that didn't feel like hers. The handwriting was familiar. Not just the curves or the slant. But the pressure. The rhythm. It was his. "Emily. If you're reading this, it means I failed to keep my promise. I didn't want you involved. But your kindness brought me back to a place I hadn't believed in for a long time. I'm sorry. Tell my mother I forgive her. Tell my father. I understand now. They'll come for you, but don't run. Running is how they find you. Stay where the light is. E." She read it once. Then again. And again. And when she looked up, her eyes were different. No more confusion. No more fog. Just clarity. "He's alive," she said. Sam nodded. "I believe he is. And I think he's trying to lead us somewhere." They drove to Detroit that afternoon, chasing a postmark with no address, chasing a trail that was barely a whisper. Their first stop wasn't an office or a mansion or a crime scene. It was a hospice. Tucked between rusted bridges and broken sidewalks, the building looked like a place where people went to forget. But inside was a man named Edgar Miles. 83. Half blind. Mostly mute. But when Sam said the name, Jonathan Walker, Edgar sat up in his bed like someone had lit a match inside his chest. "She didn't light the fire," he said, voice raspy, trembling. "She was there to watch it burn." Emily stepped closer. "Who?" she asked. He turned his face toward the sunlight as if looking for something long gone. "Her brother," he whispered. "Thomas made the call. But she gave the match." Outside, the rain had started falling in slow, deliberate drops. Sam didn't say anything right away. Neither did Emily. Some truths are too heavy to carry in one breath. But in that silence, they both knew the same thing. This wasn't just about Ethan anymore. This was about a woman who had erased her past, rewritten her name, and buried herself so deep into the Walker Foundation that not even Ethan had noticed. Lillian wasn't just protecting secrets. She was designing erasure. She was the kind of person who didn't destroy things. She made sure they were never remembered in the first place. And now, she was pulling the final strings. Back in Cleveland, Emily returned home to find something strange. Her mother wasn't there. No signs of struggle. No broken locks. Just, gone. And on the table, an envelope. Inside was a photograph. Emily. Standing in the alley. Behind her, a woman. Blurry, but unmistakable. Lillian Cross. And below it, written in perfect block letters. Time to remember. Some buildings don't just hold memories. They breathe them. They store them in the walls, in the floorboards, in the very bones of the place. They wait, patient and silent, for someone foolish or brave enough to walk back inside. The address written on the back of the photograph pointed to a place just across the Indiana border, out past towns with shuttered shops and fields where the wind never stops whispering. It wasn't a house. It wasn't a mansion. It was something in between, a place once built to impress, now forgotten by everyone who didn't know where the bodies were buried. Emily didn't wait for backup. She didn't tell Sam where she was going. She didn't even leave a note. Because sometimes, you don't need permission to finish the story, you just need to know you're finally ready to face the ending. She drove 6 hours through fog and silence, the kind of drive where every mile feels like shedding a layer of skin you never needed anyway. And when she reached the gates, rusted, twisted, chained but not locked, she felt it in her bones. She had been here before. Not in a dream. Not in a nightmare. In truth. The doors creaked open without resistance, as if they'd been waiting for her, not weeks, not months, but years. The entry hall was wide and hollow, dust clinging to the air like ghosts in waiting. And yet everything was still in place, like someone had left the lights off but never left the house. Emily moved slowly. Not because she was afraid. But because something inside her already knew the path. Muscle memory guided her through a house her conscious mind didn't recognize. Every hallway felt like a verse she'd forgotten from a song she used to hum without knowing the lyrics. Every corner whispered her name in a voice that wasn't quite hers but didn't belong to anyone else. At the end of the hallway, behind a door with peeling paint and a brass knob cold as ice, was a room with no windows. A single table. A single chair. And mounted in the wall, a one-way mirror. That's when she knew. This was it. The place the photograph had warned her about. The place Ethan had vanished into. The whisper room. Laid carefully on the table, as if part of an exhibit curated for one visitor only, was the red dress she wore that night. Not a replica. The same one. Still stained. Still folded. Still waiting. And as she stared at it, as the air thickened and her heartbeat slowed to the kind of rhythm reserved for revelations, she heard the sound that changed everything. Footsteps. Not hurried. Not afraid. Measured. Controlled. Like someone who had planned this meeting down to the second. When Lillian Cross entered the room, she didn't do it with menace or force, she did it with calm, with grace, with the kind of stillness that belongs to people who've already won. You finally came, she said, her voice smooth and deliberate, like silk stretched over piano wire. You always were the curious one. Emily didn't flinch. Didn't run. Didn't even blink. Where is Ethan? She asked, the words sharp, clear, and stripped of anything but purpose. Lillian stepped aside, revealing a narrow door tucked into the wall behind her, a seam in the shadows that hadn't been visible until she moved. He's here, she said. He's safe. But you have to understand, this isn't about revenge. This is about closure. Inside the hidden room, lit by a single overhead bulb that buzzed like a memory refusing to die, Ethan Walker sat tied to a chair. His face was bruised. His wrists were raw. His breath came shallow, uneven. But his eyes were clear. And when they met Emily's, the years between them disappeared, and all that remained was the sound of her name on his lips. Emily. She ran to him. Untied the knots. Held his face in her hands like it might vanish if she let go too soon. Behind them, Lillian didn't raise her voice. She didn't step forward. She simply watched, like an artist admiring the final stroke of her masterpiece. You don't understand, she said, and for the first time, there was something fragile in her tone, not regret, but something colder. He's not in a cage. He's being protected. If Ethan talks, people die. Cities burn. Legacies collapse. Emily turned slowly. Her body was trembling, but her voice had never been steadier. You're not protecting him, she said. You're protecting yourself. Because if he speaks, they'll finally know what you did. Upstairs, something shifted. A sound. Small. Metallic. The front door. And then. A voice. Put the gloves down, Lillian. Sam Holloway stood in the doorway, gun drawn, badge in hand, his eyes locked on the woman he'd been chasing through shadows. But Lillian didn't move. Because she didn't have to. From the hallway stepped another figure, one no one expected. Judith Parker. Emily's mother. Alive. Tear-streaked. And walking with purpose. She wasn't bound. Wasn't broken. Wasn't dragged here. She had come willingly. I didn't know, she said through sobs that echoed louder than any gunshot. She told me Ethan was dangerous. That he needed protection. That if I helped, you'd be safe. She lied. Emily's knees buckled. Not from betrayal. But from the weight of it all, the years, the silence, the pain that had been hidden under the quiet hush of survival. Sam lowered his gun. Lillian didn't flinch. She only laughed, a dry, brittle sound that cracked against the walls like thunder. You think this ends with me? She asked. You think there isn't another one behind me? Another hand holding the match? Sam stepped forward and placed a thick envelope on the table. Inside were the documents Ethan had hidden, bank records, letters, audio tapes, video files, the kinds of truths people bury in vaults and forget they ever existed. Jonathan Walker didn't die in an accident, Sam said. He was murdered. You helped hide it. And now, the world will know. Lillian looked at the envelope like it was a tombstone with her name etched into it. She didn't scream. Didn't run. She just sat down. And said nothing. Because there was nothing left to say. Outside, the sun had started to rise. And in that pale, early light, Ethan reached for Emily's hand, not as a man rescued, but as a man who had finally been found. She didn't cry. Didn't speak. She just squeezed his hand. Because some moments don't need words. They just need to be lived. When the truth finally comes out, it doesn't arrive with applause or headlines, it slips in quietly, like a tide that never stopped rising. It doesn't shout. It doesn't beg. It simply stands there, undeniable and unshakable, waiting for someone to stop lying to themselves long enough to look it in the eye. The fallout from Lillian Cross's confession didn't erupt all at once, it bled into headlines, courtroom whispers, and federal indictments with the slow, unrelenting force of justice that's been patient for too damn long. The documents Ethan had hidden, the same ones his father tried to release before dying in that so-called accident, broke open a network of secrets older and darker than anyone dared to imagine. Shell corporations collapsed overnight. Board members disappeared from penthouse offices and reappeared in holding cells with their cufflinks traded for handcuffs. And one by one, the names in the margins became names in the news, the kind that finally stayed there long enough to be held accountable. Ethan stood in front of a courtroom packed with cameras, lawyers, and men who once called themselves untouchable, his voice hoarse but steady, his hands shaking only once as he unfolded his father's final letter. He read it aloud, every word soaked in the kind of silence you don't hear very often, the silence of people listening not for entertainment, but for truth. "Don't let them bury it," Jonathan Walker had written. Not the papers. Not the numbers. Not the names. Because what they bury today will burn tomorrow. When Ethan finished, he didn't bow. He didn't cry. He simply looked at the judge and said, "My father didn't die in a fire. He was extinguished. Now I'm here to relight what they tried to put out." Emily didn't return to Aurora Connections. There was no need. The agency dissolved in days, its founders indicted, its clients subpoenaed, and its glamour stripped bare until nothing remained but shame and subpoenas. Rachel Morgan resurfaced quietly, not in a blaze of apology, but in the whisper of a plea deal that traded silence for testimony. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She didn't expect redemption. But she left a note, handwritten, folded once, and placed inside a plain envelope addressed to Emily Parker. "I made mistakes. But you reminded me that I didn't have to keep making them. Thank you for that. R." Emily, Ethan, and Judith moved into a small house outside Cincinnati, nothing fancy, nothing grand, just a place with trees that whispered instead of threatened and a porch that caught the morning light like it was holding something sacred. Judith's health, though fragile, began to recover in that way the soul sometimes heals first, and the body follows when it feels safe again. There were no more headlines. No more interviews. No more whispers. Just days. Simple. Honest. Quiet. Sometimes, Emily still dreamed of the red dress. But now, she didn't wake up gasping or trembling or searching for blood in the seams. Now, she saw it for what it truly was, not a costume, not a curse, but a thread that stitched her pain into purpose. Because sometimes, you lose your way. And sometimes, you get taken. And sometimes, just sometimes, you're found again, not by luck, but by love refusing to let go. There's a window in their living room that faces east, where the sunrise pours through every morning like forgiveness wearing gold. Emily stands there sometimes with a cup of tea in her hand and silence in her heart, not the empty kind, but the peaceful kind that comes from surviving something that tried to erase you. Ethan joins her, wraps his arms around her waist, rests his chin against her shoulder, and says nothing. Because there's nothing left to prove. Nothing left to fear. And nothing left to hide. They don't need to speak anymore. The light says everything. And somewhere, far from courtrooms and scars, in a house too old for secrets and too quiet for sorrow, the light stays on. And no one has to whisper ever again. Write in the comments where you're from, let's see how far these stories can spread. And of course, subscribe so you don't miss new exciting stories. See you soon.